Hey humans, how's it going? Susan Ruth here. Thanks for listening to another episode of Hey Human Podcast. This is episode 102, and it is with Amy. I sat down with Amy in Los Angeles in her home, and we chatted about her work in the field of cannabis. She is a researcher and an advocate and an author. She is one of the authors of the book Cannabis Pharmacy. And it's really fascinating. We talked about all sorts of things, THC and CBD and the difference between Indica and Sativa and the flora of the gut and how it deals with cannabinoids. It's a really hard word to say. Cannabinoids. Anyway, it was a really wonderful conversation. She was super open. We did just use her first name because the laws in California are still, they're still working things out, and we just wanted to protect her that way. I've got a ton of really great links for Amy's episode on heyhumanpodcast.com on the links page. And just want to remind everybody, please subscribe, rate, and review, but really especially subscribe. Let's get those numbers to keep climbing. It's doing really well, and I'm super excited and thankful for all the support you guys are giving to Hey Human. You know how to find me on social media, Hey Human Podcast, and always, please feel free to reach out to me, Susan at heyhumanpodcast.com. I love hearing from you. I answer every email, so please definitely reach out. The Amazon affiliate is on the homepage, so if you shop at Amazon, click on that portal on the homepage of heyhumanpodcast.com, and you will be taken to Amazon, where you shop anyway, and if you do so through the portal, it helps support Hey Human. So I really appreciate that. I do want to mention that we talk about her website that was being built when she and I were talking. It was supposed to be up by now, and I went and looked today. It's not up yet, but please keep checking back, because I think it's going to be a really cool website. It's called the Canna Review, THECANNAREVIEW, the Canna Review. Definitely keep checking for that. And when her website does go live, I'll have a link for it on Hey Human Podcast as well. But you can find it, obviously, through the link itself once it's live. All right. Well, I'm excited for this episode. Again, thank you for listening, and let's get started. Here we go. Hi, Amy.
Hi, how are you today?
I'm well. How are you?
Great.
Thank you for being on Hey Human. I appreciate it.
I'm glad to be here.
So we are in sunny California, and every ounce of my being wants to move here from Nashville. I love it here.
It's pretty great.
The vibe is so cool. I love it here. I appreciate you being on the show, and we are going to talk about cannabis today.
Great.
So explain to them a little bit of what you do.
I'm a researcher, so I look at the pharmacology of how cannabinoids work in the body, both those made by the cannabis plant and those made by our body, and also those made by other plants. And I look at how those work within our body to kind of tune how our body works. And then I take that information and I kind of decode it so that other people can understand it.
Okay, what got you into that?
I was asked by a friend to look at how products are made, because I had a background in molecular gastronomy. And
molecular astronomy?
Gastronomy.
Oh,
yes,
gastronomy. I was like, awesome.
So he wanted to know kind of how these things might work, and I always had an interest in how things work in the body and how we can tune the body to be more efficient. And so, and then that became kind of a journey into looking at the science. And the science was fascinating, and it was so much more broad and applicable than I ever expected it to be. That it really drew me in. It caught my interest.
Yeah.
I've never met a problem I didn't like. So I really like to solve things, and it's fun to be kind of on the front edge of something.
Yeah, definitely. It's now legal in California to?
It is legal, quote unquote, but there's a lot of gray areas. There's still a lot of areas where purveyors and people can kind of find themselves on the wrong side of the law, so to speak. But yes, technically you can You can visit California, walk into a store, and buy cannabis.
Yeah. It seems like a great leap forward.
It really is. I mean, the laws need to kind of catch up, and in some ways, the laws didn't go quite far enough. It's going to be pretty onerous of a hurdle for a lot of people to get over, and very expensive.
How do you mean? What?
In terms of just it's a very bureaucratic process. The state's doing a pretty good job of laying things out, but there's going to be a lot of consistency issues, a lot of people having to figure out how to do it in a regulated market, and that's expensive.
Mm-hmm.
So that's going to be a little tough for some folks. You're going to really probably need investment to be able to do it.
I wonder if they're going to let people out of jail who have pot offenses.
There's a lot of things. There's a lot of jurisdictions looking at things like that.
I think
yes.
They should. I mean,
yes.
if you're going to legalize it.
Yeah, and then there are places like LA where they're looking at communities that were more impacted by the drug war than others, and they're looking at helping some of those individuals in those communities and people. For instance, in Santa Barbara, if you have there's a certain level of crime. I think it may be a felony, where if you have a felony, you have kind of an advanced standing in terms of getting a license to grow now, ironically.
What?
So it's an interesting thing where, you can look at certain jurisdictions are considering that, yeah.
Huh, that's interesting.
So how I got into this was I was interested in the chemistry of food and how we can eat, what we eat affects how healthy we are.
Mm-hmm.
And how, so for instance, if I eat a lot of sugar and I have a tendency toward anxiety or depression, it may actually trigger that. And so I was very interested in those kinds of relationships within the body,
mm-hmm.
between what we eat, how we feel, what we eat, and how much energy we have, issues like that.
It is interesting considering what sugar does to the human body that it isn't regulated, and yet something like cannabis, this natural herb that has been shown time and time again to be really beneficial as far as medicinal purposes, and a myriad of other things, paper, rope, clothing, that it's vilified so much.
Yeah, it is an interesting. It's a very politicized topic. I mean, and it's also especially fascinating when you realize that there are a few medicines as quote unquote natural as cannabinoids, which are the active ingredients in cannabis, because our body makes its own cannabinoids called endocannabinoids. Endo means within. So in this case, these are cannabinoids made by our bodies to regulate physiological processes across the spectrum. We literally do not have a tissue in our body that does not contain receptors that accept endocannabinoids.
Isn't that fascinating?
So every single tissue in the body has the ability to take up cannabinoids. And the body is using those to regulate a host of physiological processes, or modulate. So it's regulate and modulate a host of processes. So it's a very homeostatic system, so it's all about balance.
Mm-hmm.
So for instance, if I have damage to the epithelial layer of my gut, which is the interior layer of my gut, or I have a cut on my finger, in both of those cases, the body will literally make more receptors at that site to take up cannabinoids that it releases to help that damage heal. But in the words of like Vincent DiMarzo, who's a very well-known researcher in this space, the things that the cannabinoids do are help us to forget,
mm-hmm.
help us to sleep,
mm-hmm.
help us to eat. So it's regulating different, kind of facets of our physiology.
Well, it's something you just brought up is interesting to me, the forgetting. So cannabis for PTSD.
Absolutely. And also in cases like, if a woman was to remember how painful natural childbirth
mm-hmm.
was, she'd probably never do it again, right? So there are cases when we need to forget,
mm-hmm.
and when our body needs to kind of a nudge in that direction. And there are also other instances of this. For instance, there's some really fascinating research out about how our body handles addiction. Mm-hmm. And there are associations and memories that we create during that process of kind of the formation of an addiction. For instance, if someone's trying to quit smoking and they walk into a bar, that may be a trigger for them to smoke. So there's some pretty interesting evidence to support the idea that certain cannabinoids can actually help break those associations.
Interesting.
So that's also kind of forgetting in that way also.
So I would think that science would be super excited about all the potential and would fight the lobbyists keeping it squashed, but
Yeah,
it's money against money, I suppose.
Well, what's interesting is that they are very excited, and there are pretty strong lobbies. I mean, alcohol lobby and other lobbies that are pushing back. There's a lot of money for law enforcement that comes from seizure. So there are
seizure as in search and seizure.
Seizure of property, seizure of things like that. But that's not really so much my focus. I really am not as much as involved in the political side of it as I am the kind of science and research side. But yes, there definitely is an enormous scientific community that is interested in this space, because now we also, the more we know about, for instance, the functioning of the gut and immunity and how important gut health is to immunity, well, cannabinoids are right in the front line of that.
Wow.
So there is even some research to suggest that it is cannabinoids, because cannabinoids in a sense are a chemical messenger, much like a neurotransmitter. So there's a lot of science there's some science to suggest that cannabinoids may be the link between mind and body. So that they are kind of the link between those two kind of facets of our health.
So what's the difference between CBD and THC?
So CBD is a homeostatic regulator, which means its job is to restore balance. And it primarily interacts with a receptor that is not capable of making you high. So it's called a CB2 receptor. And what it's doing with that is it's often coming in and kind of calming the system and bringing balance back, but it actually has the ability to kind of work in both directions, both to stimulate something or to calm it. So in that way, CBD is kind of a great balancer for the body, and THC are and these are the two kind of primary cannabinoids, but there are dozens of them. These are just the two that you hear about the most, THC and CBD. And THC works on primarily on a receptor called CB1. And CB1 is capable of, quote unquote, making you high. So that's kind of side effect of making you high is through that CB1 receptor. And that's why THC can make you high, but CBD cannot.
And it's absorptive even through the skin, right?
THC is not very well absorbed through the skin at all. It often needs some help to get through. There are things that get THC through the skin, but they're also good at getting lots of other things through your skin that you don't want. So, for instance, there's an ingredient called DMSO that will allow THC to pass more readily through the skin, but unfortunately, if you have it in your system, it will allow things you do not want to pass through your skin to pass through also. CBD is better at getting through the skin, but either you're going to have something like a surfactant, which is an ingredient used in lotions and creams that allows things to cross more readily over the skin barrier, or you're going to need a lot of it. So, in the formula, so that it actually, some of it makes it through.
Sure.
Does that make sense? So a lot of the products that are out there isn't enough knowledge about how they work. So just because there's a THC cream doesn't mean it's actually going to do anything for you.
So those CBD in Nashville, and there's a couple health food stores that sell the CBD drops, and those seem to be really popular.
CBD drops can be great, but typically a drop you're not putting on your skin. You're taking internally, right? So you can, depending on how it's formulated, you're looking at what part of the body you're trying to get it to, and what the most efficient way to get it to that part is, right? So if you are using drops and they are in a base, let's say, of sesame oil or some other kind of fat, they may not be very well absorbed through the mouth, and you may actually need to swallow them so that the stomach and the liver and the gut have a better chance at kind of getting those ingredients out, because it may be that those parts of the body are better at that.
Yeah,
right?
I get insomnia sometimes, and I take the Dr. Moxley's. They're a little bit of CBD, they're a little bit of THC, like 5 milligrams or something like that, and I take one about a half an hour before bedtime, and works like a charm. I sleep through the night, I sleep deeply, I don't wake up groggy or weird. So
yeah, I mean, and what form are those in? Are those something you dissolve in your mouth?
Yeah,
or
you
you
dissolve it in your mouth. Yeah.
It might actually be more effective if you were to chew and swallow it.
Really?
Because when you dissolve something in your mouth, you're absorbing it through the buccal tissue, the buccal, buccal tissue of the mouth, or under the tongue, sublingually. And those two areas don't have as much of a filter before they enter the bloodstream, right? So it's more the effect, if we're going to talk about kind of the side effects of the THC or the CBD, in terms of how it makes you feel, those effects are more clear and functional. But if you took the same thing, so if you took that same small, 5 milligram dose, and you were to chew and swallow it, then your stomach and liver change the delta-9 THC into a different drug. And so it's 11-hydroxy delta-9 THC. And that THC, that form of THC is it's about 1.5 to 2 times as potent, because the form itself is potent at a lower dose. And it's more of an effect that is more of a body high, so it's better for pain and sleep. So it's a heavier, broader effect. And so, but it also takes longer. So you're looking at 45 minutes to an hour, so you'd have to back up your time a little bit.
Yeah.
But you'd be less likely to build a tolerance or need to increase your dose, because you're using the body's own mechanisms to increase the strength of that, and you're changing it into something that is better at that job.
That's interesting.
So if you were to take that, let's say you had a severe panic attack or something during the day, and you wanted to take that same candy during the day and have it be more clear and functional, or let's say you wanted to split it in half, because that, around 2.5 milligrams would be approximate to about a glass of wine in terms of inebriation, right? Then if you were to dissolve that in your mouth, it would be more clear and functional. But again, swallowing the same dose is heavier, stronger, heavier, and more of a body high. So better for sleep, right? But that does beg the question, too. It sounds like you might have something that's around like a 1-to-1 dose. In other words, a ratio of CBD to THC that's roughly 1-to-1. If that's the case, that can work pretty well for sleep. If you had, by some chance, had 2 products, let's say you had a CBD product and a THC product, and you were to dramatically increase the CBD and keep the THC at 5 milligrams, you might actually have issues sleeping. And the reason is that this is a good example of how CBD works. So CBD, being a homeostatic regulator, if you're very, very tired or sleep deprived and you take CBD, it will make you very tired. So for a day or two, until you kind of caught up on your sleep, you'd be pretty exhausted. But after that, then what would happen is your body would have caught up on sleep, and then actually CBD can kind of perk you up a little bit at the wrong time. So the only way to really avoid that is to go 1-to-1 CBD and THC. So, but you may not actually need the CBD at that point to have that THC work the way that you need it to be.
It's interesting that the eating it versus, I have friends who smoke pot. I don't, because I'm a singer, so I don't want to smoke anything.
Sure.
But I remember, I smoked pot in high school, like a high school student does. Sorry, Mom and Dad. But and I remember when I was in college, I went to this beach house vacation-y thing, and with a bunch of people, and I ate a cookie off the counter, and I did not realize that it just said "eat me" on it. I was like, "Yay!" because I like cookies, and I ate the cookie, and it was a pot cookie, and it got way higher than I ever got when I used to smoke pot. Do you know what I mean? I thought, what is this strange brew?
And that's why. And that's, not that you can't reach that point via inhalation, but it's a lot easier to get to that point with eating something. And you're also kind of pointing out something that often does happen, where someone, let's say you had just a quarter of that cookie, and maybe that would have been okay for you, but given that it might not take effect for 45 minutes to an hour, you could be like, well, you know what, I think I'm going to have some more. And that's where we really find people get in trouble. And we call that kind of a cookie casualty. And but it's actually a miserable experience for someone. And you can really feel pretty out of control. You can be nauseous, you can be paranoid. You can even feel so nauseous that you might want to throw up. It's a really unpleasant experience. But that's one of the things that I'm interested in, kind of debunking some of the kind of potential pitfalls like that, to tell people this is what to expect from a dose about like that. Now, there is a bell curve, and some people are going to fit on that bell curve in terms of their response to something. Other people are going to be outside of it. But there are some general guidelines that you can follow to help kind of not find yourself in that position.
Yeah, I was thankful that I had also taken LSD in high school. So, and I didn't just eat one cookie because I didn't know they were pot cookies. And I love cookies. I ate 2. And I got higher than I remember ever being on LSD on those 2 pot cookies. A, I wasn't expecting it. B, I hadn't been stoned in a really long time, not since high school. And so my body's like, uh-oh. Thankfully, I had done drugs in the past, so I didn't flip out. and thankfully I was at the beach, so I just drank water and rode it out. But I was so high, and I imagine that if I had never done a drug, that would have been a terrifying experience.
Sure,
and the fact that they didn't write it on the bag, like these are pot.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it's also that people think, well, I mixed up my brownie batch really, really well, or I did warn people, and even baked goods are always going to be pretty inconsistent just from the way that they're made. Mm-hmm. So if there was a way, usually what's happening is you're binding the active ingredients to a fat, because the active ingredients are lipids, they're fats. So whether it's the cannabinoids or the essential oils that you're adding, those are fats. And in order to keep them kind of in the solution or in the batch, you have to bind them to another fat. It's not unlike making vanilla ice cream, where people will make cream with vanilla to kind of protect the flavor, and then they'll put it in the ice cream, right? So when you make a baked good, it's impossible to have that butter, usually, go completely consistently through the entire batch. So you will always have patches that are stronger. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people tell me stories about how they were in college and they ate the brownie. Everybody else was fine, but they ate that one brownie that just laid them down. And it's really common. Yeah. And it's because you're never really going to make a baked good that's consistent for that reason.
There's that classic scene in Taxi where Jim is in college and he's super smart and totally together. And he takes a bite of the brownie and becomes.
That's right. That's
crazy
right.
Job.
I mean,
it's a great moment.
And it is.
History.
It is. But it's a terrifying experience. I mean, the good news is that the cannabinoids themselves will never kill you. You're just going to be miserable for a while.
Right.
So cannabinoids themselves will never kill you. Yeah. You're just going to be miserable for a while, right? Totally. You're going to be really uncomfortable.
And because I'd had my own experiences, it was just like, great.
Right.
I just got to ride this out.
Well, thankfully you knew, you kind of knew what was happening, right? I mean, that element of surprise can be pretty frightening for people if they don't expect it. I mean, I've heard stories here of, someone's housekeeper eating something and not knowing what was going on and thinking they were having a heart attack or other things. Yeah. So it can be pretty frightening for people. And that's one of the things that I'm interested in kind of preventing from happening.
Sure.
Is how is it that we can help people to understand what dosing looks like so that they're not surprised, so that they don't find themselves in a situation where they feel out of control.
Do you feel like the use of this will make its way into hospitals and psychiatric
Absolutely,
work?
And in some cases it already is. I mean, if you look at Israel, they the work that's been done there, the primary active ingredients in cannabis were discovered by a scientist in Israel named Dr. Raphael Meshulam, and it is that's right. There you go. And so he's done some amazing work. He was very, very hard ahead of the game, and so. But in Israel, they are using cannabinoids to help older people, usually, to manage, issues related to health where cannabinoids can be effective. So they are being used in hospitals in certain areas of the world.
Mm-hmm. Why? This is something I've always wondered. Why does marijuana make people have cotton mouth? What is that about?
I mean, it's actually just dry mouth. It's most people will think that they are becoming dehydrated. But they're not. And cannabinoids themselves they do pull moisture from the body. And what's interesting is that if, let's say, for instance, and this is a good way to understand how our own cannabinoids work too. Let's say you are driving down the road and someone pulls out in front of you and you have a near miss. So your heart rate is up, maybe you're sweating a little bit, maybe even the blood is flowing toward the abdomen, toward the heart, right? It's kind of that fight or flight, there's a bear, I gotta run kind of feeling. And so you pull over and you're trying to calm down. Well, what the body does at that point is release its own cannabinoids to help that process happen. And it does it because they're acting as signals in the body. The cannabinoids are going upstream, so to speak, in order to calm the incoming signals. So, this is a good way of explaining how the cannabinoids work in the body and how when we introduce cannabinoids, how they work also. And so this is related to your question about dry mouth. So when you have like a near miss in a car, and you pull over, you didn't hit anything, but you kind of thought you were going to, and your heart rate's up, and you might be sweating a little bit, and your hands might be tingly and numb from the blood flow kind of rushing toward the heart. All of those things that happen in a fight or flight response, cortisol, adrenaline releases, things like this. What happens is the body releases its own cannabinoids on demand, and it's saying, time to calm down, right? Time to actually kind of realize that you're not in danger, but that chemistry needs to be present to help you calm down. Mm-hmm. So what it's doing is it's sending those cannabinoids kind of upstream, if you will. It's what's called a retrograde signal. So when your body's own cannabinoids are sent kind of upstream, if you will, and when we say upstream, we're talking about kind of back across the synaptic gap. Mm-hmm. So remember when you were in high school and you had that kind
Barely.
of...
No, I'm just kidding. So, I think we covered that.
No? Right. But when you were in biology, I'll help you remember, okay? So when you were in biology class, there was this drawing, it looked kind of like a mushroom. Uh-huh. And there was a space between one mushroom and another. And these were neurons, right? Mm-hmm. And there's a little gap between them. Well, that's called the synaptic gap. And what happens is downstream, on the downstream side of that gap, our bodies are releasing cannabinoids at that point. Mm-hmm. And then it's sending them across that gap, upstream, to say, actually, we don't need any more cortisol. We don't need any more adrenaline. The danger's past. Yeah. So it's actually stopping it at its source, which is one of the reasons that cannabinoids are so helpful with things like anxiety, because it's easier to solve something when the chemistry responsible for that thing is not being produced at all.
So what happens, can you take the body's natural occurring cannabinoids, that's a tough word to say, and extract it and then put it back within yourself?
No, because they are literally made on demand. The body's literally making them in response to something. Mm-hmm. So they're not just kind of free-floating in the body. And we're also talking about minute amounts, which is one of the things that makes them difficult to study, because you're talking about such tiny amounts. But that's actually a good cue to us, right? Because when you look at how small those amounts are and how little it takes to shift the balance of something in the body, it tells you something, well, this kind of Cheech and Chong model of big gulp, consumption of cannabinoids really is way over the top. Mm-hmm. So, the majority of the issues around using cannabinoids, things like dry mouth, kind of resolve themselves if you're only actually using the dose that you need, rather than just dosing based on what you can withstand, which is pretty much how the model works right now. Mm-hmm. It's not unlike, speaking of high school, someone saying, hey, I need a six-pack in order to kind of have that experience of drinking, rather than I'm going to enjoy a glass of wine, right? So it's a very different kind of mindset.
I need the six-pack for the experience of throwing up later.
Yeah, how miserable is that, right? And I think because even the tools that we use, the pipes and these bongs and all these kinds of things that are out there, even vaporizers, when you look at the openings in those, they look like you need a lot more than you do. In fact, the holes in most, the little hole where the air is moving through so that you can inhale, is usually too large to actually accommodate the tiny little dose that you actually need. So you actually pull it through. So you actually need a screen or something in the bowl to be able to hold that tiny little dose, because otherwise you're gonna kind of suck it through, right? Mm-hmm. So even the tools suggest, it's kind of like giving someone an extra large cup and saying, go get yourself something to drink. Someone is going to drink more because the cup itself is so large, right? But cannabinoids are more like, if you've ever done any sailing and you are, you're sitting on the boat and you're pushing off from the dock, it's very little resistance that you need, right? And where if that same boat, were on wheels on land, it would take a lot more pressure to move it. So the body makes these components, so it knows how to use them, and it also knows how to get rid of them, which is why you can take those 2 cookies, and it'll make you miserable for a while, but then you're going to be all right, because the body knows how to get rid of them. And that is one of the main differences between how cannabinoids work and how, when we introduce other compounds and medicines into our body that our body doesn't know how to get rid of, therefore it's storing them in odd places.
Like an opioid, for example?
Like an opioid, things like this, where the body doesn't know exactly how to work with it. Now, the body does make its own opioid, the endorphins, but but it's not processed in quite the same way, right?
So you brought up Cheech and Chong, which of course everybody knows is our lovable stoners. Cheech and Chong from I think the 80s. I don't know when they were, but and before we were on air, I was talking about that show that that Kathy Bates does. I think it's on Netflix. I don't remember exactly, and it's about a pot shop and everyone's always stoned, and it's got a lot of that stoner humor, which I imagine actually sets back the cause, because if people are always thinking of pot as just this thing to get you high, then what the research you're doing, where you're like, no, guess what? It does all these things that help.
Right.
How do you fight that model of
it's
really
hilarity? And honestly, I have a sense of humor too.
Sure.
And sometimes these things are really
sure.
funny.
I'm not dogging the show; it's a fun show, and I love Kathy Bates.
But I hear your point, and you're right. It is, in a way, when I meet new people, or I'm on a panel, or I'm speaking with people, there is that kind of first few minutes of, is she a quack, or is she, is this real science? And I even hear a lot, well, there's just not that much science out there, and actually there is. Mm-hmm. There are thousands of articles out there. There's lots of research that's been done. But you're right, we are kind of, in a way, going a little bit uphill against the kind of stereotypes around this. And the stereotypes are there for a reason. I mean, there's the reason that things are funny is because there's some truth in them, right? But when I look at this, I see a 12,500-year history with this plant, and I see cultures around the world that has used it for, for spiritual healing and for health for thousands and thousands of years, because people actually didn't even start inhaling cannabis or smoking cannabis until right around the time of Columbus. So it was when tobacco kind of came into kind of European culture that we would start to see people smoke it. So it was drunk, it was eaten. So if you look at other cultures where that's been a history for thousands of years, it's a very, very different story. And to me, it's a little unfortunate when there are so many people who could benefit because there's such a broad application in the body, and benefit with so many fewer side effects. It's a bit sad when someone calls from kind of the Midwest and they want to be able to use cannabinoids to help them with nausea, for instance, and it's not legally available where they are, and they're also often made to feel bad, as if they're kind of taking the easy road out, which is really a shame. So I hope that kinds of conversation does start to change, because while it's funny, it certainly is setting the cause back.
Yeah.
It really isn't helping to change the kind of the way that this is viewed.
Yeah, and I know that, so there's the anti-nausea aspects, and there's, I know people who are dealing with eating disorders where they use it to help with encouraging appetite,
Sure.
things like that.
Sure.
So there are all these wonderful benefits. It's frustrating, I'm sure, to see all the other stuff get
It is. In fact,
propagated.
I think that actually brings up a good question, because one of the things that I get asked a lot, or that I'm writing about a good bit, is, well, how can it possibly be good for so many things? And the reason is, in part, what we were talking about earlier, that there are receptors in every tissue of the body. And what it is that if you can imagine the electrical system in your house, there are lots of ways to plug in or access that electricity. So, for instance, you can directly do it by turning on a light switch or plugging in a lamp, but you can also do it at the lamp itself, right? And in a way, that's what the cannabinoids are doing in the body. So every single one of those receptors is a potential target. So when you're looking at it as a medicine, you want to look at what the body is doing with it, and then you want to say, well, how can I tune that? How can I supplement that? So when I hear, kind of stoner comedy, to me, it's a little unfortunate, because that is making it so that, maybe a Midwestern housewife might, feel less comfortable about using it when they really need it. Mm-hmm. And so, but I see that, all these kind of plug-in spots, if you will, as a remarkable opportunity for us to learn more about how our body functions and how it communicates with itself, but also as individuals to be able to tune our health. Because so it kind of brings a little bit more of that power back to us, mm-hmm. rather than just kind of looking to the medical establishment to say, how do I take care of me, right? And nothing against organized medicine, but sometimes there's some shortcomings there, and at least from women, I often hear that there's some head patting going on in terms of
like it's all in your head.
Yeah, it's all in your head, or they'll say they'll be very disparaging about cannabis and it and its benefits. And I think that also comes back to the industry too, because there are instances where they're overstating the claims. I've heard many people in the industry say, things along the lines of, it cures cancer, and there's promising research, very promising research on those fronts, but we're not there yet. Having a few cancer cells in a petri dish is not a person, and we can do an awful lot of harm if we overstate, because things like cancer treatments that are proven or have much more statistical opportunity to help someone heal. They're often medieval. They're very difficult to go through, and so people can be looking for another way, any other way. And when they hear that something is promised to cure them, they might choose to do it for a while, when actually they might should have stuck with the original treatment, and then it might be too late. Then the cancer might spread, and then the original treatment can't help them. So I think that this, the kind of over-promising is just as damaging as the kind of stoner comedy end of it. I think both of these things,
striking a balance.
There's definitely a balance between the two, because we know a lot, but there's still a lot to know.
Yeah.
So I think being more reasoned about how we describe it and what it's capable of doing, because what it is capable of doing is pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
We don't actually need to overstate it for it to be valid, right? But I think there's a balance between the two, because in a way, I agree with Dr. Andrew Weil on this, is that you have to look at the potential for harm and the potential for good. So for instance, he once I was at a talk where he described that, teaching someone how to meditate or to do deep breathing, well, it certainly isn't going to hurt them, right? It might help them, and that's great if it does, but it will not hurt them. And so when I look at this and I look at the things that are possible, I'm balancing those two things. What is the potential for harm versus the potential for helping someone?
Yeah. In your research that you've done, because you can only speak for what you know, you can read other people's research, but for you personally, what do you feel is the best use of this plant?
I would say that when you're looking at, it's an interesting thing. If you're familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? So at the bottom of the pyramid there, speaking of pulling something back from high school again, I'm I've got a little thin grip on this one. But if you look at how that works, on the bottom level of Maslow's hierarchy, the bottom levels there, you are dealing with basic needs, things like safety, food, sex, things that are kind of more primal needs. And then right around there, you're also looking at pain, right? So before we can talk about things like mood and improving mood, we have to sometimes look at where is there such a stumbling block that is so great, for instance, pain or significant anxiety, that can just shut someone down and make higher level learning or actualization impossible. So often that's the door that I'm looking at going through first. So when I'm looking at where this can help, I'm looking at those things that are most pressing because you have to solve, if you have overwhelming pain, you need to help someone solve that before you can start talking about feeling good or having a glass of wine effect so that you can enjoy a concert, for instance, right?
Sure.
You have to deal with those lower levels, more pressing things. So if I had to say things that this is best for, that's not necessarily the view that I start with. I often also look at areas where I think that the standard medicine could use a little help. For instance, the options for anxiety in terms of prescription medications are not great. Xanax is not good for your heart. But these things are, Klonopin and Xanax and these kinds of drugs are addictive. And so that's an area where medicine could use a little help. And it just so happens that we have something, CBD, or very light doses of THC, that where you can actually move the needle significantly on those issues without experiencing a quote-unquote high.
Mm-hmm.
So, because there are sub-psychotropic levels, and what I mean by that is it amounts that are so small of THC that are actually able to improve anxiety without a high. And then you have CBD or cannabidiol that is able to significantly improve anxiety markers, also again without making you high. So there are, and it's naturally processed by the body and out of the body. So you don't have a lot of the issues that you have with some of the prescription options.
Mm-hmm.
So when I'm looking at things where this could really be useful, there are things like nausea, but there are some pretty decent medications for nausea too. It's really good at nausea. THC and CBD are good with that. So it's an option, but there are other areas where there's kind of nothing there, or the option that's there is really not a great one. And so those are areas where I choose to focus.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those are issues related to how women age, how women deal with menopause symptoms, things like hot flashes, things like PMS. And that kind of gets back to that earlier discussion we were having about how women are treated in working with, working with the medical establishment, and how there is kind of some head patting going on. And now we know things like, fibromyalgia they're real issues.
Fibromyalgia.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in chronic fatigue, these things where people were kind of treated like they were little nuts. And the truth is, those are real things. And in fact, those two may actually be related to a deficiency in cannabinoids. So, there are things that we can take seriously and maybe address better with this than what is available from prescription from prescription medications.
Yeah, I'm a celiac, and for years and years and years, I had all these different kinds of symptoms, and would go to Western medicine. And again, not to diss Western medicine, but I would keep thinking, oh no, it's in your head. There's nothing wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with you. Well, turns out there was something pretty major.
Sure.
And it actually took a naturopath to finally figure it out.
Absolutely.
After years of trying to figure it out.
Absolutely. And it's an interesting thing too, because things like celiac disease, you're looking at autoimmune conditions, basically. And so, because let's say, here we are talking about gluten, right? We're talking about a protein. So, gluten's not necessarily in and of itself a bad thing. So if you don't have celiac disease, you probably don't need to cut it out, right? But in the case of someone whose body has a sensitivity to it, then it can be, pretty devastating condition to deal with. And that brings us kind of around to immunity, which is something that cannabinoids are actively involved in the body. So, for instance, there's something called immune tolerance. And when there are issues with immune tolerance, it makes it very difficult for the body to recognize friend from foe, right? So you might be someone who's always eaten spinach, and then all of a sudden you can't eat spinach. It doesn't mean that the spinach is bad or that the gluten is bad. It just means that your body is unable to recognize or process something that it should be able to do, right? And so in the case of immune tolerance, once that process starts, it can start to become kind of other things, right? So you can develop eczema or psoriasis. So a lot of these different conditions are connected, and they have an origination point in the gut, because the gut is like a second brain for the body. So it has as many, if not more, neural connections in the brain. So many researchers call it the second brain, and you're looking at about 90% of the immunity in the body is originating in the gut, and about 90% of the body's serotonin is made in the gut. So sometimes when you have someone like yourself who has celiac disease, they may also have some mood issues or issues with nausea, because serotonin is involved in mood and in nausea. So you can have other things that appear to be unrelated. And if you're a physician that is not so aware of the interconnectedness of these bodily systems, because physicians, let's say one person can only know so much, right? So we do have different specialties, but unfortunately, there's not a lot of communication between them sometimes. So you can feel like, wow, my body's just falling apart, when actually maybe you're just having problems with your gut, and it's manifesting in all these different ways.
My dad likes to say, hey, even, he says, what do you call a doctor with a C- average from school, and he's like, a doctor, because even the people who didn't do well in school still get to be doctors sometimes.
That is true. That is true. And
my dad's a card.
Yeah, right. It is true. It's true for a lot of fields. True for engineers and architects and things too, right? And so but it's also, in their defense a little bit, I have to kind of look at the fact that many of these physicians, went through school before this system was even discovered.
Oh, totally.
Right?
And I think the gut thing is really relatively new in
retrospect. It is, relatively,
especially
for the mainstream. Mm-hmm. It's been going on for a while, but now it's kind of trickling down, mm-hmm. right? And the gut really is interesting because it starts to affect so many other systems. Mm-hmm. And because the receptors that take cannabinoids up are a certain kind of family of receptors called GCPRs, or G protein coupled receptors. Well, so it's kind of like if you can imagine, so serotonin works along those receptors, opiates work along that type of receptor, cannabinoids work along that type of receptor. So in a way, there's like a shorthand between them. So if someone has issues with anxiety and pain, their pain signal and their experience of their pain will be more significant if they're also anxious. And also if someone's having problems with serotonin, well, that can affect or make them become nauseous, because these pathways in the body, it's like there's a shorthand between these types of receptors because they're related. Mm-hmm. So it's almost like if you can imagine playing guitar and you pluck the top string, but you're not using a cord to dampen the other strings are vibrating too. Not quite as much, but they're vibrating too. So in a way, if you pluck one of these kind of receptor sets or pathways, you can affect the others as well. So these are subtleties that, much like the kind of use of CBD. Use CBD during the day, makes you sleepy when you're tired, but once you've caught up, perks you up. So these are some subtleties that I think that are sometimes lost in our desire to have kind of a clean diagram for how CBD works or how the body works, or the gut is over here and the brain's over there, and so these systems we kind of want to separate them. When truthfully, there's a lot more overlap. Like watercolor washes, you can still see the yellow underneath the blue, right? So there's a lot of overlap between them, so they're affecting one another.
It is interesting, Americans spend a lot of time researching the food they're putting in their body. That's like a big thing for us. I'm sure it's that way in Europe too, perhaps, but I feel like they eat more clean maybe.
They have tougher regulations than we do too.
Yeah.
So it's a little easier to eat clean because the regulations are strong enough that you're more likely to have everything that's in, all the options are more likely to be clean than they are here.
Right. And so, and it's funny because it's just like my argument with guns, if you have a gun, you should know how to take it apart, put it back together. You should go to the range. You should be able to fire that gun. You should be willing to kill someone, really, because that's an option with what that mechanism can do. And the same thing, I feel like, if we are partaking in alcohol, you should read about what alcohol does to the body and the brain and the gut. And same with marijuana, same with cocaine. If whatever you're choosing, it's funny where we pick and choose what we want to know about what we're doing to ourselves.
Sure, and I think sometimes there's a fear, a little mental laziness on our part, where if we see something that we like, we kind of don't want to know, because then we might have to rethink our use of it.
Donuts.
Yeah, donuts. I mean, exactly, but at the same time, I think that having some knowledge really does prepare you better. I mean, I feel like there's a lot of parallels between sex ed and the education that needs to happen around this, in the sense that in sex education, typically, like a public school sex ed, there is a lot of fear-mongering, but not a lot of education. And the audience is being totally ignored. So, their interest, how does this work? Give me the inside scoop, is completely ignored. But they're shown scary pictures of syphilis and herpes and all these things, which, unfortunately, fear-mongering doesn't work. And so you're not actually educating either. So you're not giving practical knowledge. It'd be more helpful for someone literally to walk in with a banana and a condom, put it on the condom, and walk out the door than the 8 hours of herpes photos, right? And so I think that we have to kind of step back and say, who's the audience? What is the information that's relevant to them? and then give them information that's actionable that they can use. And I think there's a desperate need for that. So yes, I do think that there is responsibility on our part, if we're going to partake in this, to understand how it works. But I also think that, within the cannabis industry, there needs to be some responsibility for what is being provided to people. Because I do talk to a good number of people in this space who want to understand it better, who have gone pretty far down the path of creating products and dispensing them, but really have no idea how what they created works. And that's a little frightening. It's a little frightening when you have millions of dollars in investment and you're kind of representing to your investors that you know what you're doing. That's frightening. It's frightening on the level of customers, right, using these things. And maybe if it's a brownie, it'll never be consistent, from one edge to the other. So I think there's a responsibility on the part of people putting it out there as well as the people using it. And that's a gap that I see. And it's one of the things that I hope to, in part, solve with the website and portal that we're putting together, the Canna Review, because I want and feel like it's so important that evidence-based information be made available. Because right now, there's a lot of information out there. It's just not very good. Or it may use all the right terms, but it doesn't explain it correctly. And that can be pretty problematic for people, because if they can't extrapolate what they need to know and it's not factually correct, they could find themselves in a pretty bad spot. And, as a woman, I see other women out there trying to explore this and experiment with it, and it concerns me sometimes when I see oral products, especially, because I know how heavy and impactful they can be and how much kind of trouble you can find yourself in terms of not feeling completely in control of yourself or your judgment, that it concerns me that better dose guidance is not more readily available.
Yeah. So in your research, has there been, I assume, since California only just made things legal here, right? I mean, medical was legal for a bit, and now it's recreational too. But what does that mean for people like you who are trying to do this research under this, big brother looming ever closer?
For me, I'm not touching product, right? So I am not, I'm not out there. I have created formulations for things for people to help them understand how to do it right? But because I'm not touching product, I'm learning. So I am, it's more that I'm downloading articles, and I'm asking researchers if they would mind, sharing their research for me, because it's not out yet, or it's behind a paywall, and I can't afford $200 a paper, for instance. So a lot of my work is with a calculator and a highlighter, and so, and me kind of condensing things down so that people can understand them. So that's really the focus of what I'm doing. So I'm not as impacted, but we desperately need longitudinal studies. What I mean by that is we need studies done over long periods of time. So, for instance, it's not unusual for people to come up to me after a training or a panel and say, I have a son who is, having serious issues, and I'll say, well, how old is your son? And if he's not, over like mid-20s and above, if he uses cannabinoids, we don't know what it does to his developing brain. And I think being honest about that potential for harm is as important, if not more important, for this industry going forward as it is in recognizing what it can do and help.
That is a really valid thing to bring up, the fact that our brains keep becoming, they do for the rest of our lives. It's not just up and through the beginning of our 20s, but that's a big deal. I think about how much pot I smoked.
It is a big deal.
And I'm like, gosh, maybe I could have been a brain surgeon.
Right.
Okay.
And I tell you, it starts really early. So, when we're in the womb, our body uses cannabinoids to regulate fetal development. And then it's believed, this is emerging research, but it's believed that that system in the body then becomes the child's healing, part of its healing mechanism, right? So because obviously we don't need fetal development once we're born. So that system then turns into something else. So you're talking about also in the womb, right? You're talking about regulating fetal development. That's a pretty big deal. And that'll affect you the rest of your life. So developing brains, fetal development, we desperately need these 20-year, 10-year studies, large enough groups, because if you think about it, studies are often done on very small groups, 8, 10, 12 people. That's not a very big sample size. So even if you collect a lot of data, and lots of little points on a graph, you still only got 8, 10, 12 people. And it could have taken millions of dollars and 20 years of someone's life to get the grant and do the research.
Yeah.
So you're talking about a major investment of time and money. But we have thousands of patients that are providing anecdotal evidence, which is self-reporting, and it has some issues with that. But we need real studies. Mm-hmm. And right now, the cannabis product that is available is coming out of the University of Mississippi for sanctioned studies in the U.S. And that product, from what I hear, is of very poor quality. So you're starting with something that isn't nearly as good as what's available on the black market, even in terms of its pharmacological complexity. So if you're starting with something that's not very good, and I don't mean not very good in terms of it gets you this kind of high versus that kind of high. I'm talking about not very good in terms of medicine, of its quality. Then what's that research worth?
Sure.
So we desperately need change. I mean, I'm looking to countries like Portugal, where they have legalized everything. Because what they're doing is they're looking at it's also the label we give it, right? So in Portugal, they say addiction and drug use is a public health issue. So we need to do what we can do to change our perspective on it so that we are more free to address it, right? So I think that we could look to countries like Portugal to say, how do we need to change our view on this so we can actually move the conversation forward?
Yeah.
And, because right now, ironically, you can almost do better medical cannabis under recreational than you can medical, because the medical laws do not take into consideration quality of life. And if someone doesn't have the reason to live, then their health is affected. So, so giving them ease, social ease, giving them some relief emotionally from the anxiety or stress they may be having, those things are, I would say, almost equally as important as dealing with nausea and pain. So,
yeah, it's fascinating. And I know it's not really part of what you do, but when I was back in Washington visiting my family, it's legal there. And I went into the dispensary for the first time, and my 10th grade self was panicking, first of all, because I was like, I'm going to get grounded for being in here, and then you kind of go, okay, it's legal. But what fascinated me, again, I don't smoke it, but what fascinated me was all these different variety, and this is for, depression, this is for getting high, this is for seeing God, this is for sleeping, right. This is for, all these different varieties. And I thought, wow, the botany of it is fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Sure. And some of the terminology that's thrown around is just incorrectly used. So, for instance, you hear terms like Sativa versus Indica. Mm-hmm. And what dispensary staff are often referring to is a morphology or kind of a structure or type of plant within the kind of cannabis genus, right? And so, for instance, a sativa type plant could be 25, 30 feet tall, growing in places, tropical areas like Thailand, Indonesia, places like this, and look more like bamboo. And then if you go to places like Morocco, the plants are kind of short and squat, look kind of like Christmas trees. And you're more likely to see that type of plant, the kind of a Moroccan short, squat, Christmas tree looking thing, here in the U.S., because those plants, when Nixon declared the war on drugs, those were the plants that would grow indoors. Mm. So in Morocco, you have this short, squat plant because the plant's kind of protecting itself from the sun. It's holding onto its moisture. Whereas in tropical areas, those tall bamboo-looking plants are looking for sun. They're trying to make it through the canopy, right? So you have a plant that has developed its morphology, its structure, based on where it's being grown. So that microclimate, just like us as people, we have little microclimates in our lives, right, that affect how we feel and how we respond to things. These plants do too. And they develop certain chemistries, certain combinations of essential oils, or the building blocks of essential oils called terpenes, that are created by those plants as secondary metabolites to deal with local pests. So if a plant has it lives in an area where there's a lot of deer, the plant may develop something to repel deer. If it lives in somewhere where there's a lot of bugs, it may develop something unique to deal with the bugs. Mm-hmm. So it just so happens that those chemical components that the plant is developing unique to its climate then have pharmacological effects on us. Mm. So if I were to provide you with a sample of flower material, like buds, and I were to give you exactly the same, 2 little samples, exactly the same weight, and we tested them, and we knew they had the same levels of cannabinoids in them, okay? And let's say they both had 18% THC or 22% THC, which means that 22% of the weight or 18% of the weight was actually cannabinoids, right? That's a pretty strong flower. If I were to give you those, let's say the sample were the same. Let's just pick 18. The sample was the same. And you reported back that one of them was more clear and functional, made you want to go for a hike, paint, and the other one made you want to go eat your refrigerator and take a nap, right? The difference between those plants is the essential oils, or the building blocks of those essential oils called terpenes. So it's the terpenes that are modulating the effect. So it's like the cannabinoids are the switch, and the terpenes kind of tell you where you're going to go.
Isn't that interesting?
Right?
I had no idea.
So, for instance, so getting back to what we started with this, where those plants were originally grown, their local microclimates affect the morphology of the plant, like the structure of the plant, but they also affect the chemistry of the plant, which in turn affects us. So when a dispensary staff is saying, this is a sativa, they aren't using that term correctly and indicating a plant grown in tropical climates and with a certain structure, which is what it means. They are referring to a clear functional high, which is the effect of a plant having grown in that condition. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And the same thing for indica. So they're not actually describing that Christmas tree clumpy kind of structure. They're describing the heavy effect of a plant grown in that environment. Because, and it's a fascinating thing, because there was a point in the late 60s, early 70s, where there was a pretty well-known writer that wrote for High Times, and he said, what happened to the high? Why are we stoned instead of high? And what it was is that we didn't know what the component was. We couldn't test for it. There wasn't a test to test for it yet. But what had happened is, with the war on drugs, these plants that grew well in Morocco were being brought, or those types of climates were being brought here because they would grow well under artificial light. And when they came into the breeding programs here, they brought something called myrcene. And myrcene is an essential oil that's found in nutmeg and mangoes and lots of other plants also, that is very sedative. So it's good for pain and sleep. So when dispensary staff are talking about an indica, they're talking about a plant that creates a lot of myrcene. Okay? And that is the effect, that heavier high, that body high, good for pain and sleep. That's what they're describing. They just don't really know what the terms mean, but that's what they're indicating. So it's kind of like the best, you can only kind of, work with the tools you've got.
Right.
So they're describing it the best way they can. But that's what they're really referring to, is an effect. Okay, it just so happens that these morphologies affect that.
Right, and now the phrase is indica, couch.
yeah. Or couch lock is kind of a phrase that I hear a lot too. Well, this is something that's really going to lay you down.
Yeah.
Right?
I didn't know mangoes had that. That's why I love mangoes so much, because I always feel so happy when I eat mangoes.
They're very kind of chill.
They are.
Right? They're very kind of relaxed.
They're kind of a sexy fruit, too.
Yeah, they are kind of a sexy fruit.
Yeah.
And, but yeah, but it is, it's really fascinating that your nose can tell you a lot about the effect that you're going to experience before you even use it.
How do you mean?
Well, in the sense that, for instance, myrcene has a very kind of woody note. It's what people are kind of referring to when they use the term dank, D-A-N-K. They're referring to this kind of grandma's closet kind of smell, this kind of, not moldy, but kind of musty smell, like dried leaves or something, and that's typically myrcene. But if you have some flower material and it smells more floral and more like citrus, so there's a component called limonene, and limonene is the note. It's the essential oil or terpene, the building block of an essential oil, that is the reason that if you went anywhere in the world and picked up a piece of citrus fruit and scratched its peel, you would know that you were holding citrus without even opening it.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone would know it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the note that tells you that what you're holding is citrus, right? But limonene is a natural light antidepressant. So if you were looking for those smells and then kind of taught yourself almost like a sommelier what those smells represented in terms of effect, then you'd have a little clue as to what you were using and how it was going to impact you. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's fun.
I really find that's really so interesting. I love it. I'm learning so much. Any final thoughts I don't want to take up all your day.
I think. What have we talked? We talked about.
You mentioned a website.
Yeah, I have the. We are in the process right now. I have a frequent writing partner, and I'd like to mention the book if you don't mind.
I would love you to mention it.
And it's the second edition just came out. It's a bestseller on Amazon.
That's great. I'll put links to it on Hey Human Podcast.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah.
That'd be awesome. Because what we're doing also with the website is there'll be information on the book there.
Great. And the podcast. Sorry, I'm getting my words.
Yeah.
The website is called
The Canna Review.
Canna Review. So
it's called The Canna Review.
Okay.
And the book is called Cannabis Pharmacy. And it has a foreword by Dr. Andrew Weil, which is one of the reasons we were able to kind of get some traction with it.
Okay. Yeah, I'll put that on the links page.
Yeah, and I'll be happy to mention it too. And because, I'm trying to think if there's anything else. We've talked about kind of how the ECS works and how it's really widespread and how those systems can kind of affect one another. I'm just trying to think if there's like common holes, things that I get asked a lot that might be helpful to you.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything that I've said that you found to be confusing, or that you think that because I have about 8 different ways to explain pretty much everything.
I think you did a really great job of all that, for sure.
Anything that you're kind of thinking of that you wish things you wish you knew you understood how it worked?
I have a question. Speaking, so you bring up the scent, and I know that all of our systems are clearly connected because it's one giant body. Sure. And if smoking cannabis does something to the body, would an essential oil that you sniff do that?
You bet. In fact, it's something you have to kind of watch out for.
Oh, really?
Because, in fact, that would be actually a really interesting thing.
Okay.
Yeah. So what it is I once had a woman tell me a story about how she lives in a neighborhood where she lived within walking distance of her local grocery store, and she had used a very small amount of THC, not even enough to have like a glass of wine effect. This was like a milligram and a half, so just enough to kind of take the edge off of her anxiety. And then she walked to the grocery store, and her grocery store was a really nice grocery store, and it had a whole section of like natural care products and things like that, and it had one of those displays for essential oils, the little testers that you can smell. And she proceeded to go and smell the different testers. Well, she found herself to be extremely high, and what happened is your olfactory nerve, the nerve in your nose that allows you to smell, it's kind of that translation between the smell and your brain, right? That nerve is the only exposed nerve in your entire body. So it's extremely sensitive. Now, if she had not had that THC in her system, then inhaling those might have slightly affected her mood, or it might have shifted her mood in some way. But the fact that she had a cannabinoid in her system, we don't know exactly what the mechanism is, but we know that there is a magnifying effect. It's called, in pharmacology, it's called a synergistic effect. And what that means is that when you have a cannabinoid present, we think that it might be that it's allowing other things to cross more easily over the blood-brain barrier. And the blood-brain barrier is a chemical barrier in your bloodstream, kind of before the brain, that developed when we, at some point in our evolutionary development, were kind of in a war with the plants. So plants were trying to keep us from eating them, and we wanted to eat them. So our bodies kept developing ways to kind of counter plant poisons. So the blood-brain barrier is believed to be our body's response to plant poisons, but it does a really good job. So a lot of essential oils, or the components of essential oils, these terpenes, don't cross readily into the brain. Okay? So when you have a cannabinoid present, we believe it allows that process to occur more readily. So in a way, having a cannabinoid in your system allows you to take advantage of the promises of aromatherapy that don't sometimes quite seem to be delivered upon.
Whoa.
Right? So this woman had THC in her system, went to a grocery store, did some pretty deep inhalation of essential oils, and those two things together had a very strong effect.
Fascinating.
Okay?
Wow.
So that's what's called also the entourage effect. So it's when you're combining different compounds and they make each other more effective.
Oh, so
right?
interesting.
Which is also, in a way, not that dissimilar. It was different mechanisms. I'm oversimplifying a bit here, but it's not that dissimilar from how cannabinoids could be potentially dramatically helpful with the opioid crisis, right? Because cannabinoids, when present, for instance, if CBD is, if you take CBD and you are also taking an opiate, even though CBD cannot dock at a mu opioid receptor, which is the receptor that takes up opioids in the body, even though it can't dock directly, kind of like what's called an agonist, like a direct, good, strong link, it is something called an allosteric modulator. It means it's kind of sneaking in the side door. But what having CBD present, or even THC, by coming in the kind of side door like that, it supports the opioid at the receptor, so it allows it to be effective at the receptor longer and more effective while it's there.
Meaning you don't have to take 50 pills a day.
Exactly. And we originally saw this in interviewing people and talking to nurses who were working with hospice patients. Because what they found is that when they kind of had the feeling that maybe some of their patients were maybe using cannabis, well, actually, let me back up. They started to notice that certain patients, when they could self-administer, via like a little clicker in their hand, that they could self-administer pain medications to themselves, there were certain patients that didn't do it nearly as often as the others. And these were patients that they would have expected the pain levels to be extremely high. And so they kind of were really curious about this. Why are these certain patients not self-administering as much pain medications? And what they found in some cases, those patients were kind of sneaking a little cannabis in on the side. So what was happening is they were self-medicating and making the opiates they did take more effective. Now that was kind of a magical thing for these hospice nurses, because what they also noticed as a byproduct of that is that those people were better able to be with their families end of life. So they were not as sedated, they were not kind of knocked out in a way by these opiates, so they could be more present. And that was a pretty amazing thing. Mm-hmm. So I think that, it's unfortunate that, the current administration and, our current Attorney General are not taking seriously the positive impact that cannabis could have on reducing the addictive profile of opiates, so people could use less and take it less frequently if they had some cannabinoids present. So that's a dramatic thing in a crisis that's really kind of out of control.
Yeah, it makes me wonder, though, if the people who sell the opioid wants that to happen. You know what I mean? It's that whole follow the money thing.
Sure, yeah, it is kind of a follow the money thing. And I guess that, I think that it's a pretty, you look at the history of OxyContin. There was a fascinating New York Times article about the family that basically pushed all of that out there. It was a major PR effort and very unethical and kind of frightening.
I'll have to find that article.
It's a fascinating article and disturbing that a single family could come in and really underpin this crisis that we're seeing now. But at the same time, I feel like we could get stuck a bit by focusing on what went wrong. And it might be a better use of our energy and time to figure out where the potential solutions are.
That makes sense.
I have a writer whose work I like a lot. Her name is Clarissa Pinkola Estes, and she looks at kind of fairy tales and Jungian myths and things like that for lessons to how to live. And one of the things that she said is, wisdom is doing what works. And my grandmother had a very similar kind of expression. And so when I think of, wisdom is doing what works, I think, well, I could be very, very angry. And, there are definitely things going on politically that I'm pretty angry about. But at the same time, I need to figure out a positive outlet for that so that I'm proactive and I actually am a part of change and not just kind of feeding the anger and fear that's already there. And I think that things around the opiate crisis, things around medicine are areas we really have to do that.
Yeah, really, that's very well said.
Yeah.
Amy, thank you.
You're very welcome.
This has been fantastic.
Great.
I learned so much.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great questions.
Thank you. I will put all that information about your upcoming website. It won't be upcoming when we launch this, so it'll be out there. So everyone listening, please go visit.
So the website is the THC Canna, CANNA Review, REVIEW.com.
Perfect.
And the book that I worked on and collaborated with my writing partner is Cannabis Pharmacy. It has a foreword by Dr. Andrew Weil, and it's available on Amazon. There are 2 editions of it. The second edition just came out shortly.
That's great.
Or just came out. And it is the author on that is Michael Backus, my writing partner. And that's spelled Backes.
Perfect. And again, I'll put that on heyhumanpodcast.com on the links page. And since it's on Amazon, Amazon helps support Hey Human too. So it's a win-win for everybody. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, everyone,
You're very welcome.
for listening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.